Okay, now we're going to discuss body cavities. What a body cavity basically is a potential space in the trunk of the body. There are no body cavities in the arms and legs. Why do I say potential space? There's truly no open space in the body. These spaces are generally closed but can easily be opened without trauma to any surface. For example, if you put a couple of droplets of water on the table and put a piece of paper there, the paper will stick to the table because water exerts a surface tension. We'll discuss that in chapter 2. Because the body has so much water, these coverings, these little wax paper coverings, are stuck, but they can easily be opened up without trauma to either surface. So in other words, you could lift the paper up off the wet table and you wouldn't traumatize the table or the paper. However, if you tried to pry the top of your table off from the base, you would cause trauma. So that's not a potential space. So I say that a body cavity is a potential space, not normally open, but can easily be opened without trauma to either surface. Okay. In order to understand that piece of paper that I talked about that's stuck to the floor, I want to go to what we call the serous membranes. Okay. The serous membranes, serous means wet in medicine. So if you say something is a serous secretion, it means wet versus a mucoid secretion or something of that nature. Okay. We have some thin wax paper almost consistent the serous membranes in the body. These serous membranes encompass some of our organs in the body. Okay. In this drawing here, I want you to look at the red structure pushing towards this larger structure. This is kind of symbolic. Assume on every serous membrane there are two layers. Something called a parietal layer, which is more on the outside, the periphery, and another layer called the visceral layer. Viscerous means organ. So this particular layer will stick directly to the organ. Let's say here's a structure like the lung or something, pushing into this. As it pushes, this would be that, then you'll see it go in. When it goes in, this portion here sticks directly to the organ, which we would call the visceral layer. And this layer here stays on the outside. Then you have this space between the two, which I'm going to call a cavity. There would be some fluid in here. If it's around the lungs, which is called the pleural cavity, it would be pleural fluid. Again, back to my statement of a potential space. So as you can see, it pushed in, and now you have a double layer bag. You have one portion stuck to the organ and the other on the outside. Let's go to another drawing. Here would be an example of the heart. It's in what we call the pericardial serous membrane. Okay. The way it would work is it would be like pushing your fist into a balloon. When you push your fist into the balloon, one portion of the balloon would stick to your hand, to the fist, and that would be called the visceral layer. The other layer would be on the outside. That would be what we call the parietal layer. And the space in between is what we would call the pericardial cavity. So if someone was to say, is the heart in the pericardial cavity? No, it's being surrounded by the it's not in it, but it's being surrounded by the pericardial cavity. So that's what we're looking at. Okay. So we go back then, now that we have the serous membrane, I'm going to say that on the body cavities, which are only in the trunk, we have a dorsal cavity, which protects the nervous system we'll look at, and then we have a ventral cavity in the front. So we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. So we go here, and I'm going to say, here's our dorsal body cavity. The dorsal body cavity, one cavity surrounds the brain. Remember, surrounds the brain. Underneath the skull, surrounding the brain. That's what we call the cranial cavity. Then we have a cavity directly around the spinal cord. That's what we call the spinal cavity. Okay? So again, when we go to our body cavities, we have a ventral cavity and we have a dorsal cavity. Okay? This would be the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal cavity is made up of the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Then when we go to the front, we go through tissue and we go to the front, we have the ventral body cavities. Ventral body cavities. We separate them like this. Here is your diaphragm. Above the diaphragm, we have the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm, we have what we call the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the diaphragm essentially separates the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity again is a ventral body cavity. So the ventral body cavity, the anterior body cavity, is in the front, diaphragm separated, and then here would be the abdominal pelvic. Okay, let's go to the thoracic cavity, which is separated into different cavities. 2 pleural cavities for the lungs, 1 cardiac cavity, and something called the bronchomediastinal cavity. Okay. Okay, so I come here now. Serous membrane we talked about. So in the thoracic cavity, what we have that serous membrane aspect surrounding the lung. One layer surrounds the lung itself and is stuck to it. That's called the visceral pleura. The other layer is away from that, and that's what we call the parietal pleura. And between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura is the pericardial cavity. The pleural cavity. Is the pleural cavity. So we have 2 pleural cavities. Then we go to the heart. What the heart is going to have, go back here, we'll use this drawing, is one layer of a serous membrane is surrounding the heart, and that's what we call the visceral layer, visceral pericardial layer, and the other is on the outside, the parietal pericardial layer. That's right there, as you can see in the center of the chest there. So that essentially would be the heart cavity. So we have these 2, the 2 pleural and this one. And then we have a space left over that we'll call the mediastinal cavity. The space left over is basically that this space is outside the 2 pleurals and outside the pericardial, but you still have a space. You still have a space. And in that space, you'll find things like the aorta and things of that nature there. That's what we call the mediastinal. Why? Because it's behind the mid area of the sternum, if you could see it. Okay. So going back again as a review, the dorsal cavity had 2 structures. The cranial cavity around the brain and the spinal cavity around, pay close attention, around the spinal cord. Then the ventral cavity has 2 divisions. The ventral cavity has the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic. Above the diaphragm is the thoracic, which is subdivided because of the serous membranes into the 2 pleurals, pericardial and a mediastinal. The abdominal pelvic cavity is a little more tricky in that there's actually no separation. So what we do is that below here would be the abdominal pelvic. Now, there are 2 schools of thought on this. One school of thought is anything above what we call the peritoneum. The peritoneum is another serous membrane that surrounds the organ. So right here, to show you, here would be, let's say, your intestine. Surrounding stuck to your intestine would be your visceral layer here, visceral peritoneum. And then this would be the parietal peritoneum. So this would be what you call the peritoneal cavity right there. The peritoneal cavity right in this area here. Okay. Go in here then, when we look, go back to one here, you can see that the peritoneum dips down. So some will use the peritoneum, which means anything under the peritoneum would be in the pelvis, which would be like the uterus and the genitalia in the man and so forth. Others will use the iliac crest, and we'll talk about that when we get into anatomy. But in other words, the abdominal pelvic cavity is this cavity, and there's no strong line of demarcation as you had between the abdominal pelvic and the thoracic cavity. So just realize you have these two in the ventral. All right. We go next to the abdominal pelvic regions. Okay, let me tell you quickly what this is. You could take a marker and mark on yourself these regions. You're not going into the body, you're just making lines on the body. There are two methods to do this. One is the 9-region one. The 9-region one, which I'll just briefly mention, is you have 9 regions. Lines would be drawn just like this. You have a right hypochondriac region. In this case, hypochondriac is not somebody that likes to go to the doctor all the time. Hypo, below the chondros, which is the cartilage, so below the ribs. Epigastric, above the stomach. Again, left hypochondriac. The lumbar region, because that's where your lumbar vertebrae. Umbilicus here, left lumbar. The iliac or the inguinal. The inguinal, that's the region of this body. The iliac crest is there. Hypogastric, below the stomach, and so forth. Now that's the 9-segment one, and that is okay. The one we use in medicine, though, and what you would use in clinical, is the quadrant. It's much easier. So in the quadrant system, you just draw a line. That would be the belly button right there. You have a right upper quadrant, left upper, right lower, and left lower. Okay? What I want you to do is this, is to try to locate structures in each quadrant. For example, here's your appendix right there. Okay? So if I was to say Joe came to the emergency room and had pain in the right lower quadrant, what kind of structures would be involved? Here's the appendix, and right there's your cecum right there. Here's the gallbladder, right upper quadrant, could be pain there. If you had pain in the right upper quadrant, it would be that. If you had pain here, it could be the sigmoid colon, and so forth. So again, in medicine, we use the quadrant system. In more of a biology aspect, they use the 9-segment. But all of you all are going clinical, so what I want you to be familiar with is the quadrant system. There are other body cavities too, but the most significant ones we are discussing are the ones I just named in the trunk. Okay, so I hope that this helped you on the body cavities. Thank you very much.